In this video, we're going to see how to perform a resistor sweep. So this is something that you'll need to do for the pre-lab for lab 2, as well as in other labs in future classes. So instead of looking at this in our op-amp circuit, let's make a new separate circuit where we can set up a simple voltage divider. So I'm going to make a new page by coming over here to our sort of main tab for our PSpice program. Right-click Schematic, New Page, and let's call this new page Resistor Sweep. Okay, so now I can open our new page. And so here we are with our resistor sweep. So let's just make a really simple voltage divider circuit. So let's put a voltage source and a couple resistors. So I've just selected all the libraries. So VDC. So you see that's actually showing as being in my design cache because I've used it recently. So escape to stop using that. And let's look for our R, which is also in the design cache, but we know that's also in our analog library. So I'm going to put one resistor here, and I'm going to click R to rotate and put another resistor here. And escape to stop placing that. And we're also going to need a ground, so I'm going to click G. And so from any of these should be fine. So let's place our ground right here. So now I'm going to go ahead. This is a relatively small circuit. Let's zoom in so we can see this better. And I'm going to click W to wire everything up now. So just wiring our components. And so the basic idea here with our sweep is what we're going to be doing is we want to change the value of R4 and see how that affects the circuit operation. So for instance, maybe we want to look at what happens when R4 is 100 ohms, what happens when R4 is 200 ohms, and we could look at various values and see how the circuit changes. The easiest way to sort of track that is to be looking at this voltage here. So again, instead of just talking about this as being node in 00962, let's go ahead and place a net alias to make that a little more easily identifiable. So let's call this, for instance, our resistor voltage. And so you can call that whatever you want, and we'll place it next to that node to associate it with that node. And so note now this is resistor voltage. Okay, so let's update our voltage source. Let's give that a value of 10 volts to make everything nice and easy in terms of calculation. And so if we were to run a bias point simulation right now, what we would expect is to see 5 volts across R4 and 5 volts across R3 because both resistor values are equal. So we see the voltage split in half. Based on our voltage divider equation, as one resistor, for instance, R4 gets larger, we would expect to see more voltage across R4. So we'll see if we can't observe that when we do our resistor sweep. So the first thing we need to do if we're trying to sweep a resistor is we need to introduce a global parameter. And so we can do that by going to our special library. So if you don't have this, follow the rules or the procedures for how to do that in the PSpice basics document. So we want this part called param. So I'm going to click enter and then click to place it and escape to stop placing. Okay, so now we have this thing for parameters. So what we can do now is double click that to bring up our detailed properties. And what we're going to do is add a new property. And this new property, let's say it's our load resistor, so we can call it RL, call this whatever you like. And we're going to put a value of, let's say, 1K. And so what this value is just a default value. So maybe we're not always going to be running the sweep. Maybe we switch to a different simulation profile where we just do a bias point. And so this is the default value that resistor R4 would have. So let's go ahead and apply that. And so in this case, we don't want to add any other parameters. We just have that one. We could add multiple global parameters here if we wanted to, though. So now we see over here that this RL has populated with our default value. If we come back to our sort of circuit page here, we'll notice we still don't have anything shown. So if we want to see the value here, which oftentimes it's good to see the variable name and the value, we can right-click this value of 1K, select display, and we see right now it's set to not display, so we can display the value only, the name only, or what I'm going to do here is name and value. So let's click OK. Go back to our circuit, and now we see that RL equals 1K. Okay, so we've set up this global parameter called RL, and so again, that could be any other name that you choose. So now we need to associate a resistor with this global variable. So it's not limited to just one resistor, so we could associate several resistors to this variable if we wanted to. But in this particular example, we're just going to associate our resistor R4. So the easiest way to do this is to double click on this value of 1K to bring up this properties menu. So I'm going to close this because we can also just double click on the resistor in general, and that's going to bring up this more detailed property menu. And so whether we're doing it through this detailed menu or the other one, what we're interested in is this value here. So let me go back to our circuit. So we'll notice when I click on the 1K, we're editing our value. And so what we want to do is we want this value to be the name of our parameter inside of curly brackets. So the curly brackets are very important. So I have RL in curly brackets. And we see that's updated there. Okay, so now this R4 is associated with this global parameter. And so what that means is if we're doing a sweep of RL, our R4 is also going to be sweeping. However, if we're not sweeping RL during some simulation, then our R4 value is just going to be this default 1K value. So let's come up here and make a new simulation profile, and let's maybe call this R sweep. And so we have a few options depending on our circuit. In this case, we're just looking at a DC circuit. So we're going to do DC sweep. But if we're looking at a different type of circuit, it's also possible to do these sweeps for AC sweep or in our time domain transient analysis as well. So I'm going to select DC sweep. And so notice we have options to do a primary and secondary sweep. In this case, we're only sweeping one thing, so we just are going to configure our primary sweep. So we have some default options here for voltage source, current source, and some different parameters and temperatures. So notice there's no default option for resistor. So that's why we need to set up this global parameter. So what we're going to do is we're going to select, we want to sweep global parameter, and our parameter name is RL. And so again, that should just match whatever we've used to label our global parameter here. Notice here we do not need the curly brackets. The only place we need the curly brackets is down here where we're defining where we're linking that to our resistor in the circuit. So now we need to set up the specific sweep. So you see on the left we have a few options. We can do a linear sweep, a logarithmic sweep, or a value list. And so it just kind of depends on what you're trying to look at. In this case, let's set up a linear sweep. So let's say we want to start at maybe 100 ohms, and we want to end at 5K ohms, and we want to do that in steps of 100. So we're incrementing by 100. So what that's saying is we're going to analyze the circuit at 100 ohms, 200 ohms, 300, 400, all the way up to 5K ohms. In some cases, you might want to do logarithmic. In some cases, maybe you only have a few specific values, so that is also an option. So let's just stick with our linear for now. So I'm going to click OK to set that up. And then once that is set up, we're good to go. So let's run our simulation. And so this is going to pop up in a new window, or if you already have the window, it'll just update the results. So you might have to actually click over to that. And so we'll just give this a minute here. And so we see our simulation is 100% complete, so it didn't take too long there. And so one thing to note is that the variable that we're sweeping becomes the default variable on this x-axis. So there is a way that we can change that, and we're not going to cover that today, but that is included in that PSpice basics document as well. Okay, so let's add a trace. Let's say we're interested in that V out voltage. So again, we can kind of limit our parameters over here. If we know we're looking at voltage, we can deselect current and power. And so one thing to note is we still have these voltages from our other circuit. So this V output, let's go back to our circuit. This was actually from our op-amp circuit that we had in a previous video. So note, all of this is still being simulated because it's in this same PSpice project. So that's why we need to be careful about using different names for our nodes and our variables. So in this case, we call this resistor voltage. So we're looking for V resistor voltage. So we see it right here. So let's select that, click OK. And here we see how this resistor voltage is behaving. So recall, looking at the circuit, we said when R4 is 1K, that's sort of an easy place to check because with R3 equals R4, we expect the voltage to be split in half, so 5 volts across each resistor. So let's come take a look at this, and we see when R3 is 1K, our voltage is 5 volts as expected. And so this is a pretty simple example, but of course we could do this in some of our more complicated circuits like you're going to do in the pre-lab for your op amp, or as we'll see in future classes, even more complicated circuits than that.